Hello, my name is Andy Gillies. This is a speech for simultaneous interpreting practice, and it's based on a very similar speech that you also find on this channel, the ISIT 2026 Diploma speech. I'll begin the speech now. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So I've been asked to talk to you about global climate governance. And I wanted to start with a very topical point, namely that recently I was watching a Hollywood blockbuster film called Hail Mary. And it did seem to me that this was rather relevant to the topic of this speech. Why? Well, let's first of all look at what the film is about. So the title, Hail Mary, it actually relates not so much to religion as to American football. And the Hail Mary pass, rather obviously it relates to the prayer, a Hail Mary, but a Hail Mary pass in American football is when, rather than having a short and well-constructed play to follow, the quarterback, with no other options, simply lobs the ball as far and as high as he can in the direction of the goal line and hopes that someone catches it. Now the film Hail Mary then essentially takes that last shot, last resort, hoping beyond hope sort of idea and applies it to a climate disaster. And the climate disaster that is underpinning the film is that the sun is cooling down, and that this will destroy life on Earth, certainly make it extremely unpleasant for the next few decades, and that therefore the world needs a global response to this disaster. And the global response is to build and launch an international spaceship, which is to set off to one of the nearby stars, which hasn't been affected by the same problem as our sun, and return a solution to Earth. The spacecraft itself can't return to Earth in the film. Now, I don't want to give a spoiler and tell you how the film ends, but it is Hollywood, so you can probably have a guess. But I think it's a very interesting idea. I mean, on the one hand, we have this global environmental disaster that the nations all get together to solve. But on the other hand, in the film, the climate is getting colder, and that's the problem, not hotter. Now, if you wanted to put your conspiracy theorist head on, you could say, well, why on earth didn't they choose the planet getting hotter and hotter, needing a solution to that, which is kind of the problem we have. It's almost as though the anti-climate change thought was being planted in people's minds, because what the film shows at the beginning is countries coming up with ways to create more greenhouse gases to heat up the planet more and counter this cooling effect. It could almost be called psychological propaganda. But let's come back to today's topic now in a more formal sense. When we think about global governance of environmental issues, we tend immediately to think of climate change. But actually, the first example of global governance of an environmental issue was the way we dealt with the ozone hole. Now, for many years, the ozone hole was the number one environmental issue. But now we hear very, very little about it. Why? Because it was successfully tackled. So let me give you a bit of history. In the early 70s, 1974, two scientists, Molina and Rowland, theorized that a continued use of the chemicals CFCs would damage the ozone layer. So let me explain first of all what CFCs are, and then what the ozone layer is and why that's a problem. So CFCs were discovered in the 1920s, 1930s, and they were considered to be something of a a miracle chemical. They were not toxic, they were easy to produce, they were cheap, and they did a few useful things. Most notably, they were useful in cooling systems, in fridges, and air conditioning. The ozone layer, they suggested, was being depleted by the CFCs making their way up into the atmosphere. Now, in 1985, a scientist based in the Antarctic, Jonathan Shanklin, confirmed their theory based on about 20 years, more than 20 years of data that he was looking at. The ozone layer was indeed being thinned out by CFCs. So what was the problem? Well, the ozone layer protects us from ultraviolet light coming from the sun. And scientists basically said that if the ozone layer were to continue thinning at the rate it had in the 1970s and early 80s, that the Earth would be pretty much uninhabitable by 2050. And even in the 80s and 90s, there were higher rates of skin cancer, for example, in Australia, which is much closer to Antarctica, which is where the main ozone hole was. And Australians to this day are still far more aware and careful about exposure to sunshine and sun cancer issues because of that period where the ozone hole was really exposing them to far more ultraviolet and therefore risk of skin cancer. So as I said, Shanklin published his findings in 1985. Just 2 years later, the Montreal Treaty came in, basically banning, or at least pledging almost complete reduction in the use of CFCs. And indeed, 20 years later, in 2005, 98% of the chemicals listed in the Montreal Treaty were no longer being used. I beg your pardon. 98% of the quantity of the chemicals listed were no longer being used. So that was a major success. And this brings us then back to climate change. Because of the success of the Montreal Treaty in the 80s and early 90s, when it came to tackling climate change, which was becoming an issue in the early 90s, an issue people were talking about and politicians were concerned about, then it seemed logical to do something similar to what had been done in Montreal. And the first conference of the parties, the first COP, took place in 1995. And in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. And the aim of the Kyoto Protocol was to limit greenhouse gases and thus limit the increase in global temperatures. But that's 30 years ago. So why are we still talking about climate change? Clearly, it hasn't been as effective as the Montreal document was on CFCs. That was so successful we'd forgotten about it. Climate change is still an issue, we're still talking about it, but we haven't really got anywhere. Why? Well, I think there are some fundamental differences between reducing the use of CFCs and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. First of all is that greenhouse gas emissions come from fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are a far bigger part of everybody's day-to-day life than CFCs ever were. It's relatively easy for a normal person to go out and buy a different fridge, one that has an alternative to CFCs in it, rather than CFCs. But it's much harder, as we've seen, to not drive your car or to change to an electric car, which are much more expensive and which 30 years ago didn't really exist. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that in 2016, Donald Trump came to power in the US, and he was an out-and-out climate skeptic. Now, those of you who are based in Paris might remember that the 2015 COP21 was considered to be a great success, and the world came together to really double down on its commitment to challenging climate change. So Trump's election in 2016 really stopped that before it got going. And then in 2024, Trump was elected again, and he simply continued that trend of speaking out against climate change and basically operating policies that were not particularly climate friendly. So he's been an outspoken proponent of further oil exploration and drilling, for example. As with many things, the US tends to lead the way. So if the US can ignore what's being said about climate change, then so can other big countries. China, India, Russia. So we have to ask ourselves, when we think about climate change now, where do we go? Can we stick to the COP agreement, or do we need a new tack? And that's where I think Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada's recent speech at the Davos meeting, is particularly interesting. Now, in a different version of this presentation, I read from Mr. Carney's speech. I won't do that this time, but you can find that speech if you're interested online. What Carney is basically saying is that the old rules-based global order is over. But that at one and the same time, that doesn't mean we have to descend into chaos. It's not just either about multilateral versus bilateral. So the rules-based order that he's talking about, we often describe as multilateral. But it doesn't only have to be bilateral, because countries that only negotiate bilaterally with big powers like the US do so from a position of weakness. So what Carney actually suggests is what he calls variable geometry. And this will be a term that's very familiar to French speakers in the EU, because it is a calque from French. And it basically means that different countries can do things at different speeds, at different times, as it suits them. So the way I understand what he says as applying to climate change is twofold. First of all, countries do need to group together, even if it's not all countries grouping together at the same time. Even groups of countries that don't include all countries will still be stronger than individual countries. And it might well be that a grouping of smaller countries comes up with an approach or an idea that is successful, and that attracts larger countries to participate. This you could see in the example of IT and phone technology being sold by the US in Europe. Excuse me. The EU comes together as a group of countries and creates regulations. So when the US wants to sell IT and telephones in the EU, it has to abide by EU regulations. So the EU is obviously not all countries of the world, but some countries have come together, created a group, and a big country, the US, has to meet the regulatory obligations if they want to sell on that market. So that's a demonstration of the power of medium-sized or middle powers coming together. These regulatory restrictions, by the way, are often called non-tariff barriers, but I think that that has a negative connotation, and Carney is very much framing this in a positive light. The other way that I think his approach can be applied is this variable geometry, as he calls it. And that means that the middle powers, as he calls them, so countries like Canada, India, the UK, Germany, can make different agreements with different countries. So you might have, for example, Canada and the UK and Mexico coming up with an agreement on methane emissions. But Canada, the UK, Germany and Finland coming up with an agreement on solar power. And Canada finding a different agreement on electric cars with Australia and Japan, just to give you some examples. And these agreements would be in each country's interests. They may or may not be successful, but they don't require all the countries of the world to agree. So they have a bit more flexibility, and their chances of success are perhaps a little bit better. Is Mr. Carney right? Is this the way forward? Well, I think he is right when he says that the current situation can't continue and that we will not solve climate change or other issues by waiting for the whole world to agree. So if you like, his suggestion is at least a positive one. It's a possible solution. We will probably have to try it out to see if it's a success. I think it is definitely going to be better than just sticking our heads in the sand and ignoring the fact that at the moment countries are simply not meeting their climate targets, and many countries have no intention of doing so. So I have my fingers crossed, and I hope that this will lead to some progress, shall we say, because I think that there is a global environmental problem to be addressed still.